The military barracks smelled like metal polish, sweat, and fear. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering as if hesitant to witness what was about to unfold. New recruits shuffled through the corridors, backpacks slung awkwardly over shoulders, boots scuffing the concrete. Everyone was tense. Everyone was aware of the unspoken hierarchy, the silent test that awaited any soldier brave enough or foolish enough to step into this space. Then came Private Rachel Ray Lawson. She walked in quietly, a figure of controlled purpose. Her boots, worn and scuffed from previous service, thudded against the floor in a rhythm that spoke of experience, of hard nights spent on foreign soil, of missions few dared to imagine. The soldiers in the barracks paused, sensing immediately that she was different. Not flashy, not loud, but different. A group of men lounging near the training area straightened in unison. Their grins were sharp and predatory, smiles that had haunted weaker recruits in the past. Carter, their unspoken leader, leaned back against the wall, sizing her up with the kind of scrutiny that comes from years of dominance. "You lost, little girl," he said, voice carrying just enough menace to cut through the air. His friend snickered, echoing the sentiment. Ray didn't flinch. Not a muscle betrayed fear. She kept her eyes straight ahead, scanning the room with quiet awareness, her gaze measured and precise. Her jaw set slightly, her lips pressed together in the faintest line. She didn't look like she was just walking into a barracks. She looked like she had walked through deserts, jungles, and combat zones that most of these men could only dream about and survived. Another grunt, bigger and bolder than the rest, bumped into her shoulder. Laughter erupted like a chain reaction, bouncing off the concrete walls. Carter stepped forward, placing himself directly in her path. "You really think you belong here?" he asked, tilting his head, a smirk curling across his face. "You don't even look like you know what you're doing." Ray's hand twitched slightly near her belt, but only for a moment. Then she exhaled softly, the movement almost imperceptible. She muttered something under her breath, a phrase so quiet that only she could hear it, but the weight behind it made the men pause just enough to notice that she wasn't intimidated. "You're out of your depth, pretty girl," another soldier added, stepping closer. "This is our world." Ray finally lifted her eyes to meet theirs. They expected hesitation, nervousness, maybe even the tremor of uncertainty. Instead, they saw the steel behind her gaze, the quiet confidence of someone who had walked through hell and returned unscathed. Carter's smirk faltered just a fraction. "What's your deal anyway? You just some officer's daughter getting a free ride," he jeered, trying to regain control. Ray smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile meant to charm. It was sharp, precise, and contained a subtle warning. "Some of us earn our place quietly," she said. "Others just talk loudly." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Carter and his crew froze. That small hesitation was enough to break the rhythm they relied on to intimidate others, but their arrogance pushed them forward anyway. Carter's fist clenched at his side and he stepped closer, just enough to invade Ray's personal space. "We'll see about that," he muttered. "We'll see who stands at the end of the day." Then the sound of boots against the floor cut through the tension, sharp and authoritative. Heads snapped toward the source. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. At the far end of the barracks, the door opened. In stepped a man whose presence alone commanded attention. Commander James Hawk Donnelly, a living legend in the SEAL community. Every recruit knew the stories. Impossible missions, high-risk operations, a calm that could steady the most chaotic battlefield. And now he was here. The soldiers straightened immediately, a ripple of fear and awe running through the room. Carter's smirk faltered completely. This was no ordinary superior officer. This was someone who had walked through war zones where death lurked in every shadow, who had faced dangers they couldn't even imagine. Hawk's eyes scanned the room and then they landed on Ray. He stopped, his expression unreadable, but his attention alone was enough to silence the room. Ray didn't move. She didn't need to. Hawk's gaze assessed her posture, her stance, the calm confidence that radiated from her every movement. "You're Private Lawson." Hawk's voice was low, calm, but carried a weight that made even the bravest soldiers tense. Ray straightened, standing a little taller. Her response was silent, a nod just subtle enough to convey acknowledgement and readiness. Hawk's eyes lingered, the faintest trace of approval passing between them. The room shifted. The soldiers, who had been so sure of their dominance moments ago, felt a wave of uncertainty. They had assumed Ray was just another green recruit, someone easy to push around. But Hawk's presence changed the dynamics entirely. Carter, trying to regain control, took a step forward. "Sir, she's—" Hawk interrupted, his tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Private Lawson has served in operations you couldn't even comprehend. Show her the respect due." A murmur ran through the group, disbelief and tension mixing into something almost palpable. Ray's lips curled into the tiniest smirk, a subtle signal that she was aware of the effect she had on them, that she carried experience they could not measure or understand. Carter, however, was stubborn. "She still has to prove herself, right?" he asked, his voice carrying a mixture of challenge and bravado. Hawk's hand moved slightly toward his belt, the gesture subtle but loaded with authority. Silence slammed down like a guillotine, and even the room itself seemed to pause in anticipation. Ray didn't react outwardly. Her posture remained impeccable, her hands at her sides, but her eyes flicked to Carter with a look that suggested she had faced worse and come out unscathed. Carter's jaw tightened. He had no idea what he was dealing with, and that would soon become painfully clear. The tension in the room thickened. Every soldier present felt it, the silent understanding that this was no ordinary recruit, no ordinary day, and no ordinary confrontation. Something had shifted. And then, just as Carter opened his mouth to respond, the door behind them clicked again. Another presence, quiet yet commanding, entered the room, drawing the gaze of every soldier present. No one moved, no one spoke. The air was electric, charged with unspoken questions. Who had just entered? Why did the room freeze in anticipation? What was about to happen next? All anyone could do was wait and wonder. The room held its breath. The door at the far end of the barracks had opened, and every soldier's instincts screamed to obey. Even Carter's bravado faltered for the first time that day. In stepped a man whose presence shifted the air. Commander James "Hawk" Donnelly moved with deliberate precision. His boots clicked against the concrete floor like a metronome, each step punctuating the sudden silence. Hawk was tall, broad-shouldered, with a posture that radiated confidence without a word. His face, weathered by years of impossible missions, was sharp and commanding. His eyes, pale and piercing, scanned the barracks like a predator assessing its environment. Every soldier straightened instinctively. Carter, the self-proclaimed alpha, swallowed hard and forced a nod of acknowledgement. The others exchanged nervous glances, realizing their previous attempts at intimidation had just collided with a force they couldn't comprehend. Hawk's gaze moved deliberately to Ray. The room seemed to narrow around them, the rest of the soldiers fading into the periphery. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. The aura of authority that emanated from him filled the room like a wall of ice. Finally, Hawk's voice cut through the tension, low, calm, yet so heavy with authority that it made the bravest soldiers flinch. "Private Lawson," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. Ray straightened, responding not with words but with posture. She lifted her chin slightly, her spine perfectly aligned, her shoulders squared. Every muscle spoke discipline, control, and experience. Hawk's gaze lingered, studying her with the intensity of a man used to reading people in life-or-death situations. The soldiers, who had been ready to ridicule her, felt the floor drop from under their confidence. Carter's jaw tightened, and he clenched his fists, realizing that the woman he thought he could intimidate was not only unshakable, but also recognized by someone who had fought and survived where they hadn't. You've served in operations most of these men couldn't even begin to imagine, Hawk continued, his voice still calm but laced with the weight of authority. Show her the respect due. A ripple of disbelief ran through the room. The soldiers looked at each other, unsure how to respond. Some tried to mask fear with forced smiles, others stiffened, caught between arrogance and the instinct to obey. Carter, however, stepped forward, attempting to reclaim his dominance. "She still has to prove herself right," he said, voice loud enough to echo through the barracks. Hawk's eyes, icy and unwavering, flicked to Carter. A silence heavier than steel filled the space. Hawk's hand shifted slightly, brushing the edge of his belt, a subtle reminder of the authority he wielded. Carter's bravado wavered. Every instinct told him this was no time for defiance. "You underestimate her," Hawk said finally, his voice low but lethal. "And that will be a mistake you'll regret." The tension in the room tightened like a coiled spring. Carter opened his mouth to respond but found no words. Hawk's reputation alone had silenced him. The other soldiers watched in a mix of awe and fear. Ray, meanwhile, remained calm, her lips curling into the faintest hint of a smirk. It wasn't smugness. It was a quiet acknowledgement that she had anticipated this moment. Carter tried again, stepping closer, his voice rising. "Sir, with all due respect, she's—" Hawk's hand moved ever so slightly, and the motion froze him mid-sentence. The room seemed to vibrate with tension. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights couldn't compete with the gravity in the air. Hawk's gaze returned to Ray, measuring, assessing, calculating. He had seen soldiers like this before, those who carried a past so heavy with experience that it could intimidate even the bravest of men. But Ray was different. She didn't just carry experience, she carried a presence that commanded it. "You're here for a reason, Private Lawson," Hawk said. "Not for anyone else's approval, not for anyone else's fear, but for your own mission and for the missions you will lead." The room held its breath again. Some soldiers stared, trying to process the weight of Hawk's words. Others shifted uneasily, recognizing that Ray's authority wasn't given, it was earned. And for the first time, they realized that she had already earned something they could only dream of. Carter, refusing to back down, stepped even closer. "But sir—" Hawk's eyes narrowed ever so slightly. His next words were measured, almost surgical. "Private Carter," he said, his tone cold enough to cut steel, "questioning my judgment will not end well for you." Carter's face flushed. The reality was sinking in. He was no longer in control. The woman he tried to belittle now stood protected, not by rank but by respect earned in the field. Hawk's recognition wasn't just a shield. It was a spotlight, illuminating the truth they had all tried to ignore. Ray adjusted her stance slightly, her fingers brushing the worn fabric of her uniform. She wasn't intimidated, she was aware, calculating, ready for whatever came next. Hawk's presence reinforced her authority, but it didn't define her. She had been tested before in places where failure wasn't an option, and this, she knew, was only the beginning. The soldiers murmured among themselves, some too intimidated to speak, others trying to maintain a semblance of bravado. Carter clenched his jaw, struggling to maintain his facade. He had assumed this would be easy, a routine display of dominance over the new recruit, but he had miscalculated entirely. Ray's smirk deepened slightly, almost imperceptibly. She didn't need to fight them today. She didn't need to prove herself, not yet. Hawk's presence had done enough. Then, as if sensing the perfect moment to remind them all of the stakes, Hawk's voice cut through the tension once more. "This is your first lesson, soldiers," he said. "Respect is earned through action, not intimidation. And Private Lawson will teach you more in the coming days than you've learned in your entire careers." The words landed like a hammer blow. The soldiers glanced at each other, understanding that the dynamics had shifted completely. Carter's anger burned, but even he couldn't deny the truth. Ray Lawson was untouchable, and Hawk's recognition made that crystal clear. For a brief moment, silence enveloped the room. The only sound was the faint hum of the lights and the distant echo of boots outside the barracks. Then, as the soldiers tried to collect themselves, the unmistakable tension of anticipation filled the air. Something was coming, something that would test every assumption they had made about strength, skill, and authority. And everyone, even Carter, knew it. The arrival of Hawk wasn't just a command, it was a warning. The question lingered in every mind. What exactly had they walked into, and how far would Private Lawson push them before the truth of her abilities became undeniable? The air was thick, electric, charged with the promise of confrontation, revelation, and lessons that no one would forget. And in the corner of the barracks, Ray Lawson stood, calm, collected, and ready, knowing that the real test had only just begun. The morning sun had barely risen when the recruits were herded into the training yard. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of dust, sweat, and oil from the obstacles scattered across the field. For most of the soldiers, this was just another grueling day. For Private Ray Lawson, it was another stage in a performance that had been years in the making, a test that went far beyond physical skill. The yard was alive with the low murmur of anticipation. The recruits exchanged nervous glances, sizing each other up. Some were athletic, some aggressive, all eager to prove their dominance. Carter, of course, was at the center, exuding confidence that bordered on arrogance. He had spent years learning how to intimidate, how to dominate, and he assumed today would be no different. Ray walked at her own pace, her boots scuffing the dirt softly, her gaze scanning the field with calculated precision. She had seen obstacles like these before, but she wasn't here to simply pass the test. She was here to command respect, to establish a presence that could not be ignored. Every step she took exuded quiet control, a reminder that she had survived situations these men couldn't begin to imagine. The first exercise was a combat simulation, a series of attacks, grapples, and defensive maneuvers designed to test reflexes, strength, and mental endurance. The soldiers assumed they had the upper hand. Men lunged toward her, tried to overpower her, whispering threats in her ear. Carter, confident in his perceived superiority, pushed her roughly during one of the maneuvers, expecting her to stumble. She didn't, not even for a moment. Instead, she twisted with a fluidity that seemed impossible, using his momentum against him. Carter fell into the dirt with a grunt, his pride shattered before his body hit the ground. The soldiers around them froze, momentarily stunned. The air was thick with disbelief and tension. Ray straightened, brushing the dust from her uniform as if nothing had happened. Her eyes swept the yard slowly, taking in the expressions of the men who had assumed they could intimidate her. Fear, awe, and a hint of panic flickered across their faces. "You all need to pay attention," she said softly, almost to herself. But the tone carried enough authority to make even the loudest soldiers step back. From the sidelines, Commander Hawk observed silently, his expression unreadable. He had seen this before, the quiet ones who carried the storm within them, but even he allowed himself a brief nod of acknowledgement. Ray's precision, her control, and her calm under pressure spoke volumes. The second obstacle was a wall climb, requiring upper body strength, balance, and timing. Ray approached it with ease, her movements smooth and deliberate. One by one, the other soldiers attempted to follow, some struggling, some faltering, all underestimating the physical and mental discipline required. Carter tried to regain some of his lost dominance. He sped up, attempting to scale the wall faster than Ray, but impatience betrayed him. His foot slipped, his hand caught on the rough wood, and he tumbled back onto the ground, cursing under his breath. Ray didn't even glance at him. She reached the top gracefully, pausing only to look down at the men who had tried to mock her. The yard was silent, save for the sound of heavy breathing and shifting feet. The soldiers were beginning to understand that Ray Lawson wasn't just another recruit. They had underestimated her in every possible way. Next came a simulated combat scenario. Each soldier paired off, practicing offensive and defensive moves under the watchful eyes of their instructors. Carter chose Ray as his opponent, determined to assert control. But every maneuver he attempted was met with flawless defense and calculated counterattacks. Ray moved like water, flowing around his aggression, redirecting it effortlessly, turning his strength into weakness. At one point, Carter shouted, "You're just lucky." Ray's response was a single, measured movement. She twisted his arm just enough to throw him off balance, sending him sprawling to the ground once again. This time, the yard erupted, not with laughter but with gasps. The sound carried a mixture of shock and admiration. "You think you're tough?" Ray asked, her voice calm but cutting through the tension like a blade. "Try keeping up." The soldiers realized, some with dawning horror, that luck had nothing to do with her skill. Years of experience, precision training, and a controlled mindset had brought her here. The woman before them had faced far more dangerous opponents than they could imagine. By midday, sweat poured down faces, uniforms were streaked with mud, and the recruits were exhausted. Carter, humiliated, glared at Ray with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "How are you doing this?" he demanded, though part of him already knew the answer. Ray didn't answer verbally. She merely adjusted her stance, her muscles taut and ready. Every motion was precise, calculated, and deliberate. She was in control, every inch of her body reflecting confidence earned through years of grueling preparation and impossible missions. Hawk's voice cut across the yard, calm and commanding. "Enough, stop." The soldiers froze mid-movement. Carter's chest heaved as he realized that even Hawk's presence could not overshadow the lesson Ray had just imparted through action alone. Hawk approached, his eyes never leaving Ray. "Private Lawson," he said, voice low and deliberate, "you've made your point. These men need to learn that experience and skill outweigh arrogance and intimidation." Ray's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. She didn't gloat. She had no need to. The respect she commanded had been earned in silence, through performance, through discipline. The soldiers began to understand, some reluctantly, that their assumptions had been shattered. Carter's shoulders slumped slightly, though he still struggled to hide his frustration. He had underestimated her, and the consequences were clear. Ray glanced at the other recruits, her eyes calm and steady. She wasn't done testing them, not fully, but she had already made her mark. Every step, every movement, every silent command of presence had demonstrated something the men could not ignore. She was formidable, untouchable, and unshakable. Hawk gave a nod of acknowledgement, a silent approval that carried more weight than any words. He had seen this before in the field, soldiers who carried authority not through rank, but through the raw force of skill and experience. Ray Lawson was one of them. The final exercise of the morning was a timed obstacle course, a grueling series of challenges meant to test endurance, agility, and mental toughness. The soldiers lined up, muscles tense, adrenaline pumping. Carter eyed Ray with a mixture of determination and desperation, refusing to be outdone. Ray approached the course calmly, taking a deep breath, her eyes scanning every obstacle, every challenge. She moved with a quiet precision, every step measured, every jump calculated. She surged through the course like a force of nature, leaving the men scrambling in her wake. By the time she crossed the finish line, the yard was silent again. The soldiers stared, stunned, their energy sapped not only by physical exhaustion but by the realization that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Carter stumbled to the finish line, sweat pouring down his face, chest heaving, pride in tatters. Ray didn't look back. She had already moved past the challenge, already planning her next steps, already commanding the silent respect of everyone present. Hawk approached the finish line, walking with measured steps, his gaze locked on Ray. "Private Lawson," he said quietly, "you've set the standard. These men will follow or fail. Remember that." The tension in the yard remained thick, electric, charged with unspoken questions. What other skills did Ray possess that they hadn't yet seen? How far could she push them before the full weight of her experience became clear? Carter looked at her, frustration and awe battling in his expression. The rest of the recruits whispered among themselves, trying to process the lesson of the morning. Intimidation meant nothing against someone who had truly earned respect. And for Ray Lawson, the test had only begun. The battlefield of hierarchy, arrogance, and authority had just opened, and she was already several moves ahead. The sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the yard, but the real shadow, the one of uncertainty and awe, fell across every soldier who had dared to challenge her that day. One thought lingered in every mind, unspoken yet undeniable. This woman was unlike anyone they had ever faced, and she was just getting started. By evening, the barracks had transformed. The quiet confidence of Ray Lawson had shifted the energy of the place like a storm rolling in over still water. Soldiers moved differently now, some with caution, some with grudging respect, and a few, like Carter, with simmering anger barely contained beneath the surface. The day's exercises had left most of the recruits exhausted, mud streaking their fatigues, sweat streaking their faces, muscles trembling with fatigue. But Ray walked through the hallways with the same composed poise, each step deliberate, measured, and unshakable. Her boots echoed softly against the concrete, a metronome of calm amidst the simmering tension. Carter, however, was not ready to admit defeat. He watched her from across the room, his mind spinning with frustration. The arrogance he had relied on to dominate newcomers had been shattered, piece by piece, by a woman he still assumed had no business standing in his barracks. "Think you can just stroll in here and show us all up?" Carter muttered under his breath, packing slightly. He clenched his fists, each movement radiating tension. "We'll see how long that lasts." Ray, seated quietly on a bunk, didn't respond. Her eyes, focused and steady, flicked only occasionally toward him. She was aware of every whisper, every glare, every attempt at intimidation. Years of experience had trained her not to react immediately, not to feed into the bravado of lesser men. She let them reveal themselves, let them expose their weaknesses. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small patch, slightly worn, faded from countless operations, a seal insignia. Carter noticed it first, and his expression faltered as realization hit him. The patch was not ornamental, it was earned through missions that would leave most recruits gasping at the stories they couldn't even begin to imagine. "Where did you get that?" Carter demanded, his voice low but sharp, tinged with fear and disbelief. Ray's lips curved slightly into a faint smile. "Some of us earn our place quietly," she said softly, her eyes locking onto his, "while others talk loudly." The words hit Carter like a punch. He had underestimated her. Every move, every action, every quiet gesture now carried a weight he couldn't deny. The other recruits looked on, whispers rippling through the room, all mixed with apprehension as they realized that Ray Lawson was not here to prove herself to them. She had already proven it long before stepping into this barracks. Still, Carter refused to be intimidated completely. He stepped closer, leaning into her personal space, his anger palpable. "Don't think a patch makes you special," he spat. "You're still one of us, just another recruit." Ray remained calm. She didn't need to argue. She adjusted the patch in her hand, her movements subtle yet deliberate, a silent display of experience and authority. Every line of her posture, every flicker of her eyes radiated control. She didn't speak. She simply let the weight of her past do the talking. Before Carter could respond, a sharp knock echoed from the doorway. The sound was crisp, precise, carrying authority. Every soldier froze. Even Carter's bravado wavered, caught in the ripple of recognition that followed the knock. The door opened, and there he was again, Commander Hawk. His presence immediately filled the room, commanding attention without a single word. The soldiers straightened instinctively. Carter, caught between defiance and fear, barely managed to meet his gaze. Hawk's eyes swept the room, assessing every soldier, lingering momentarily on Carter before resting on Ray. There was no need for introductions. His presence alone was a statement. Ray Lawson's authority was recognized at the highest level, and any challenge to her was futile. Hawk's gaze softened ever so slightly toward Ray, a silent acknowledgement of her skill, her discipline, and the quiet authority she wielded. For the other soldiers, it was a stark reminder that she wasn't just any recruit. She was someone who had been forged in battles and missions that dwarfed their own experiences. Carter, his pride bruised and his anger simmering, tried to reclaim some semblance of control. "Sir," she still knew, "she can't." Hawk's gaze cut him off, sharp and unwavering. "Private Carter," he said, his voice low and precise, "underestimating Private Lawson will be a mistake you'll regret. Show her the respect she's earned or learn the hard way." Carter's jaw tightened, his fists clenching. He knew Hawk wasn't bluffing. The commander's words carried more than authority. They carried the weight of experience, of missions survived, of lives led in impossible conditions. Carter had walked into this barracks believing in his own dominance, and it was crumbling before him. The tension hung thick in the air. The other recruits watched, silent witnesses to the unraveling of arrogance and the quiet imposition of earned respect. Ray didn't flinch, didn't speak, didn't need to. Her calm demeanor, her measured movements, and her quiet confidence were enough to shift the atmosphere entirely. Hawk stepped closer to Ray, his voice lowering even further. "Private Lawson, your record precedes you. Today, the men will learn that experience outweighs intimidation and discipline outweighs noise. But be ready. This is just the beginning." Ray nodded slightly, the faintest acknowledgement of the challenge before her. Her hand brushed the patch on her jacket once more, a symbol not just of her past accomplishments, but of the authority she carried effortlessly into this room. The soldiers around them shifted nervously. Carter's eyes burned with frustration, his pride wounded, but even he recognized that the dynamics had changed irreversibly. Ray Lawson was not just another recruit. She was a force, a standard, and an unspoken warning of what true skill and discipline looked like. As Hawk left the room, the silence lingered. The soldiers were left to process the lessons of the day. Intimidation meant nothing against experience, loud words meant nothing against skill, and arrogance meant nothing against presence. Ray Lawson sat back on her bunk, calm, collected, and unshakable. She knew the pressure would mount further in the days ahead. The men would test her, push her, try to undermine her, but she was ready. Every challenge, every confrontation, every whispered threat had prepared her for this moment. And as the night fell over the barracks, a quiet realization settled over every soldier. This was a woman who had survived far more than they could imagine, and she was only getting started. Carter, packing in the corner, clenched his fists one last time before collapsing onto his bunk in frustration. Ray's eyes, calm and unyielding, followed him for a moment. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The respect she commanded was already absolute. Yet in the quiet of the barracks, a tension remained, an unspoken question hanging in the air like smoke. What would Ray Lawson do next, and how far would she push them before they truly understood who they were dealing with? The night deepened, shadows stretching across the bunks, as every soldier lay awake in the weight of the lesson they couldn't ignore. Ray Lawson had arrived, and the pressure was only beginning to mount. The morning sun cut through the barracks windows in sharp, angular beams, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. The soldiers moved with hesitant precision, their eyes flicking toward Ray Lawson more often than they cared to admit. The events of the previous days had shifted the barracks hierarchy, and everyone felt it, most of all Carter. He paced near the training area, jaw tight, hands clenched, pride still smoldering from the lessons he'd received. Ray, meanwhile, sat quietly lacing her boots with careful precision, her eyes calm, sharp, and calculating. She was aware of the whispers, the glances, the barely concealed resentment. Yet she didn't rise to it. Her authority wasn't a matter of intimidation. It was earned, embodied, and absolute. Carter approached, forcing himself to mask his frustration with a false bravado. "You think you can just waltz in here and command respect?" he asked, his voice low but aggressive. "You're just a recruit. You don't belong here yet." Ray looked up slowly, her gaze steady, unflinching. Her lips curled into the faintest smirk, a small, controlled display that carried no arrogance, only the quiet confidence of someone who had survived battles most men couldn't imagine. "Respect," she said softly, "is earned, not demanded, and you'll learn that the hard way if you need to." Carter's hands twitched at his sides, a storm of fury barely contained. "I don't need lessons from anyone," he spat, "especially not from you." Ray didn't respond verbally. Instead, she rose, her posture impeccable. Every movement carried authority, a precision honed through years of operations where mistakes were deadly. The soldiers nearby instinctively gave her space, sensing that this confrontation was far beyond ordinary conflict. Before Carter could make another move, the sharp click of boots on concrete echoed through the room. Every head turned. The tension in the air snapped like a wire. Commander Hawk entered. His presence filled the barracks, an invisible wall of authority that forced even Carter to hesitate mid-step. Hawk's gaze swept across the room, lingering briefly on each soldier, then locking onto Ray. "You've tested them enough for now," Hawk said, his voice calm but weighted with authority. "It's time they understand what true respect looks like." Carter swallowed hard. His chest heaved as he realized Hawk's arrival changed everything. Ray Lawson wasn't just another recruit. She had the endorsement of a living legend. That recognition alone was enough to shift the power dynamics irreversibly. Hawk stopped a few feet from Ray, his eyes sharp, assessing yet faintly approving. "Private Lawson," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "stand at attention." Ray complied instantly. Her posture was perfect, her composure unwavering. Every line of her body radiated discipline and authority, a silent assertion that she was more than ready for what was coming. The other soldiers watched in stunned silence. Some whispered among themselves, others simply stared, unsure how to react. Carter's face flushed with anger and disbelief. He had thought he knew how to handle recruits. He had thought intimidation would work. But this woman and the commander who endorsed her rendered all that irrelevant. Hawk's hand moved slowly, almost imperceptibly, toward his belt. It was a subtle gesture, one that carried a world of unspoken authority. Carter's bravado faltered under the weight of it. He had never faced someone like Ray before, and certainly not someone with Hawk's backing. Hawk's eyes returned to Carter. "Private Carter," he said, voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "underestimating your fellow recruits, especially those with experience far beyond your own, is a mistake, one you'll not want to repeat." Carter's fists clenched. He wanted to argue, to assert dominance, but Hawk's gaze, and the unspoken threat it carried, kept him rooted in place. The realization hit him. He had no leverage here. Ray Lawson was untouchable, and Hawk's presence made that unmistakably clear. Turning back to Ray, Hawk nodded once, crisp and formal. Then, in a gesture that carried profound weight, he performed a sharp, precise salute. It was more than recognition. It was acknowledgement of her skill, her discipline, and the authority she had quietly established in the barracks. Ray's hand rose in perfect synchrony, returning the salute. The motion was smooth, confident, and deliberate, signaling not just acknowledgement, but the silent bond between two soldiers who understood the cost of experience and the meaning of earned respect. The effect on the barracks was immediate. The soldiers around them froze, the room crackling with tension. Where once Carter had dominated with bluster, now Ray held the center. Where once arrogance had been enough, now discipline and earned skill reigned supreme. Carter's face twisted in frustration. He had underestimated her, humiliated himself, and now stood exposed in front of his peers, and a commander whose reputation alone was enough to demand obedience. Every instinct screamed at him to challenge her, but every rational thought warned of disaster. Ray lowered her hand from the salute, her eyes calm, unwavering. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Hawk's acknowledgement and the silent recognition of her authority carried more weight than any words could. For the first time, the soldiers saw her not as a newcomer, not as a recruit to be tested or mocked, but as a leader in her own right, a woman who had survived missions, conflicts, and challenges that dwarfed anything they had encountered. Hawk's voice cut through the tension once more. "These men," he said, gesturing toward the gathered soldiers, "will learn more from Private Lawson in the coming days than they ever could from intimidation or arrogance. Pay attention. Learn the lesson before it's too late." The soldiers shifted uneasily. Some whispered to each other, trying to process the reality before them. Carter clenched his fists so tightly his knuckles whitened, but even he couldn't deny the truth. Ray Lawson had set the standard. She had earned her place not through threats, not through loud words, but through skill, discipline, and calm authority. Ray stepped forward, her boots hitting the concrete with measured precision. She didn't speak, but her presence alone communicated everything. She was ready, she was capable, and she would not be challenged without consequence. The room remained silent, heavy with tension. The other recruits looked at each other nervously, some realizing for the first time that they had underestimated her completely. Carter's eyes met hers. For a moment there was a flicker of understanding, fear mixed with reluctant acknowledgement. He had learned a harsh lesson. Appearances were deceiving, arrogance could be deadly, and Ray Lawson was not a woman to be trifled with. Hawk gave one final nod toward Ray before turning to leave, his boots echoing against the floor. The room exhaled collectively, though the tension lingered. Everyone knew the confrontation wasn't over, it was only the beginning. Ray remained standing, calm, collected, and unshakable. Her eyes swept over the soldiers, assessing, measuring, silently warning. She didn't need to speak. Her posture, her discipline, and the silent approval of Commander Hawk said it all. She was a force to be reckoned with, and any who doubted her would soon find out the hard way. The tension in the barracks was electric, charged with unspoken questions. How far would Ray push them? What would happen when she decided to truly test their limits? And most importantly, how would Carter respond when he realized he could no longer control the narrative? The answers were uncertain, but one truth was undeniable. The arrival of Ray Lawson had changed everything, and the barracks would never be the same. The final thought lingered in every mind, heavy and unshakable. This woman had survived far more than any of them could imagine, and she was only getting started. The sun had barely risen when the barracks came alive with activity. The air carried the sharp tang of metal, sweat, and anticipation. Today, a new kind of challenge awaited, the sort that tested not only skill but resolve, endurance, and the thin line between fear and respect. The soldiers assembled in the training yard, their movements cautious, eyes darting toward Ray Lawson. The memory of the previous confrontations, the wall climbs, the obstacle courses, the silent authority she wielded, still lingered in their minds like a shadow. Carter, packing along the edge of the yard, looked ready to explode. His pride had been bruised, his dominance shattered, yet stubbornness held him upright. He refused to accept what had happened, refused to acknowledge the quiet storm that had entered their ranks. Ray, standing apart from the group, adjusted her jacket and laced her boots with methodical precision. Her gaze swept the yard, noting every soldier's posture, every twitch of muscle, every flicker of uncertainty. She didn't need to announce herself. Her presence spoke volumes. Every soldier instinctively gave her space, sensing that this day would be different. Commander Hawk appeared on the far side of the yard, his boots striking the concrete with deliberate authority. The soldiers straightened immediately. Carter clenched his jaw, knowing Hawk's presence always signaled a serious evaluation. Today's challenge would not be just physical, it would test strategy, judgment, and composure under pressure. "Today," Hawk began, voice calm but commanding, "you will learn that leadership isn't granted. It's earned through action, decision, and resilience. Private Lawson, he said, his piercing eyes locking on hers, you will lead this exercise. A murmur ran through the group. Whispers of disbelief, curiosity, and quiet fear spread among the soldiers. Ray had already demonstrated her capabilities, but now Hawk had elevated her role. She was no longer just a participant, she was the authority, the leader, and the standard by which they would be judged. Ray nodded subtly, accepting the responsibility. She didn't need words. Her posture, her calm determination, and the faint glint of focus in her eyes communicated readiness. Carter's eyes burned with frustration. He had believed he controlled the hierarchy here, yet this woman had not only claimed her place but now commanded him and the rest of the recruits. The exercise began. Ray led the soldiers through a series of complex tactical scenarios, hostage rescues, strategic simulations, and coordinated attacks. Each scenario was designed to push them physically and mentally, forcing split-second decisions and testing their ability to function under stress. Carter tried to assert himself, barking orders and attempting to regain control, but Ray anticipated his moves, redirecting the team with precision. Every soldier followed her lead, some reluctantly, some with awe. The once chaotic energy of the yard was now structured, disciplined, and focused. At one point, a simulated threat appeared on the training field, an unexpected complication Hawk had introduced to test leadership under pressure. The soldiers froze, unsure how to respond. Carter hesitated, indecision flashing across his face. Ray, however, stepped forward calmly, assessing the situation with practiced eyes. "Flank left," she commanded, voice steady, carrying authority without arrogance. "Cover the perimeter and maintain formation. I'll handle the neutralization point." The soldiers followed, moving with surprising coordination given the sudden complication. Carter's frustration turned to confusion. How could she manage this so flawlessly? Every move, every instruction was precise. She wasn't just responding, she was controlling the battlefield with a calm intensity that left no room for error. As the exercise intensified, Hawk observed silently, noting every movement, every decision, every action. He had seen countless soldiers in his career, yet Ray's ability to combine experience, calmness, and strategic precision was exceptional. The yard was tense, the stakes high, and yet Ray navigated the chaos effortlessly, turning potential failure into coordinated success. The climactic moment came when the scenario escalated into a high-stakes extraction challenge. A simulated hostage situation required split-second decisions under duress. Carter froze at a crucial moment, unsure of the proper maneuver. Ray, moving with decisive clarity, intercepted, coordinating the team to success. The operation concluded with every target neutralized and the objective completed flawlessly. Silence followed, thick with tension and disbelief. Carter stood frozen, muscles tight, as the realization set in. Ray Lawson had not only led them but outperformed every expectation, every assumption, every preconceived notion they had about her capabilities. Hawk approached, his gaze sweeping the exhausted soldiers before settling on Ray. "Private Lawson," he said quietly but firmly, "today you've demonstrated what true leadership looks like. Not through force, not through intimidation, but through skill, calm, and command. These men will learn from you, whether they want to or not." Ray's expression remained composed, yet a faint glimmer of satisfaction crossed her eyes. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The lesson had been delivered through action, undeniable and absolute. Carter's face burned with frustration, anger, and reluctant admiration. He had assumed he could intimidate her, challenge her, even dominate her. Now he realized he was completely outmatched, not physically, but strategically, mentally, and morally. Ray Lawson's authority wasn't a result of rank or bluster. It was earned, lived, and impossible to contest. The yard remained silent, every soldier processing the intensity of what had just occurred. Whispered exchanges hinted at awe and disbelief, but no one spoke openly. The lesson was clear. Skill, discipline, and experience outweighed arrogance, intimidation, and noise. Ray stepped forward, walking slowly among the soldiers, her gaze assessing, measuring. She didn't need to lecture or chastise. Her presence alone communicated the hierarchy now established. Each soldier felt it, the unspoken understanding that this woman had survived challenges far beyond their imagination, and that she was a standard they could neither match nor ignore. Carter, shaking with frustration and humiliation, met her gaze. For a fleeting moment there was acknowledgement, an unspoken admission of her superiority. Yet he was stubborn. He wouldn't submit entirely, not yet. But even he couldn't deny the reality. Ray Lawson had changed the rules of engagement in this barracks forever. Hawk's voice broke the tension again. "Dismissed," he said, authority resonating in every word. "But remember, today's lessons extend beyond this yard. Respect is not given, it's earned. And Private Lawson has earned it in full view of all of you." The soldiers filed out, heads low, minds racing, carrying the weight of the day's revelations. The challenges had tested not just physical capability but psychological endurance, leadership, and adaptability. Every soldier knew that Ray Lawson had set a standard they could not ignore, a benchmark that would shadow their every action going forward. Alone in the yard, Ray Lawson adjusted her jacket, her movements deliberate, calm, and precise. The day had been exhausting, yet she felt a quiet satisfaction. The challenge had been met, lessons had been delivered, and the soldiers had begun to understand her presence and authority. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the training yard, one truth lingered in every mind, unspoken but undeniable. Ray Lawson was untouchable, unstoppable, and just getting started. The barracks had changed. The hierarchy had shifted. And for the first time, every soldier, including Carter, understood that the arrival of Ray Lawson had brought a force far beyond intimidation, authority, or ego. A force forged by skill, experience, and the silent, unyielding power of a woman who refused to be underestimated. The challenge was over, but the war for respect, recognition, and understanding had only just begun. Night had fallen over the barracks, casting long shadows across the concrete floors and cots. The only sounds were the low hum of the lights, the occasional shuffle of boots, and the whispered conversations of soldiers still digesting the day's relentless challenges. Every movement felt heavier, more deliberate, as if the very air carried the weight of what had transpired. Ray Lawson sat alone on the edge of her bunk, her uniform perfectly arranged despite the day's exertions. Her eyes scanned the shadows, alert and calculating. Every whisper, every glance, every subtle movement from the other soldiers was catalogued and processed. Experience had trained her to anticipate, to read, to understand before others even revealed themselves. She knew that the real reckoning wasn't over, it was about to begin. Across the room, Carter paced, each step punctuated by frustration and simmering anger. His pride had been shattered repeatedly, his attempts at dominance crushed under Ray's silent authority and the unyielding recognition of Commander Hawk. Yet, stubbornness held him upright. He wasn't ready to submit, not fully, not while the embers of his ego still burned. "You think you're untouchable," he muttered, voice low, teeth clenched. "You think that patch and some fancy moves make you better than the rest of us." Ray didn't answer immediately. Instead, she rose gracefully, her movements fluid, controlled, and deliberate. She walked toward him, each step echoing with authority, the faintest trace of challenge in her eyes. The other soldiers instinctively gave her space, their murmurs silenced by the presence she projected. "Untouchable?" she asked, voice calm but sharp, carrying the weight of someone who had faced far greater danger than he could imagine. "I didn't come here to be untouchable. I came here to set the standard. And right now, that standard is higher than any of you can reach without discipline, skill, and focus." Carter's jaw tightened. He stepped forward, forcing himself to meet her gaze, anger and disbelief warring in his expression. "You think you can just walk in and dictate how we act," he spat. We've been here longer than you. We know this place. You don't. Ray's hand lifted ever so slightly, a gesture so subtle yet charged with authority that it froze him mid-sentence. Her gaze didn't waver, it didn't flinch. It was steady, measured, and impossible to ignore. I don't need to know this place to lead, she said quietly. I don't need your permission to set the standard. You'll learn respect whether you want to or not. A tense silence followed, thick enough to slice with a knife. Carter's face flushed with frustration. He wanted to argue, to push back, to reclaim his dominance, but every instinct told him this confrontation was far beyond his control. Ray Lawson wasn't just a soldier. She was a force he couldn't touch, a standard he couldn't match. The door to the barracks opened suddenly, and Commander Hawk stepped in, his presence immediately commanding attention. The soldiers straightened instinctively. Carter froze, chest heaving, caught between defiance and the undeniable authority radiating from Hawk. Hawk's eyes scanned the room, assessing every soldier, lingering briefly on Carter before settling on Ray. This isn't just a test of skill, he said, voice calm yet weighted with authority. It's a test of character. Leadership isn't given, it's earned through action, composure, and discipline under pressure. Today, Private Lawson has proven herself. Now it's time for the rest of you to reckon with that reality. Carter's fists clenched, knuckles white, but even he couldn't find words. Hawk's gaze was unyielding, and the silent authority of his presence amplified the weight of Ray's own skill and experience. Ray took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew the reckoning wasn't just for Carter. It was for every soldier who had doubted her, who had underestimated her, who had assumed that intimidation could replace competence. She had proven her strength in the yard, in every obstacle, in every decision. But now came the test of acknowledgement, of respect, and of quiet submission to the standard she embodied. Carter finally spoke, voice low and bitter. So what now? You're just going to stand there and show us how perfect you are. Ray's smirk was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it carried more weight than words. No, she said softly. I'm going to make sure you all understand that being here isn't about ego. It's about capability, discipline, skill, and if you can't match it, you'll be left behind. The other soldiers shifted uncomfortably. The air was thick with tension, a mix of awe, fear, and reluctant admiration. Carter's pride burned, but even he had to admit she was right. Every movement, every decision, every quiet display of authority had shattered the illusions they had clung to. Hawk stepped closer to Ray, his expression unreadable but approving. He gave her a slight nod, a signal that her actions, her leadership, and her presence were recognized at the highest level. The room seemed to contract around them, every soldier aware of the shift in dynamics, of the unspoken lesson being delivered through silence and observation. Carter's anger simmered, but he realized that confrontation in this moment would serve no purpose. The challenge had shifted. Ray Lawson wasn't just a competitor. She was a standard, a benchmark, a force of nature whose authority had been silently cemented. The reckoning unfolded slowly. One by one, the soldiers began to adjust their posture, their demeanor, their approach. Whispers of acknowledgement, subtle nods of understanding, and careful movements replaced defiance. Carter, still bristling, understood the truth he had been avoiding. Ray Lawson had changed the hierarchy, and there was no reclaiming it without proving himself in ways he hadn't yet considered. Ray didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her authority was absolute, her presence commanding, her skill undeniable. Every soldier, Carter included, recognized it without a single word being spoken. Hawk's gaze swept the room one last time. "This is the reckoning," he said, voice carrying the weight of experience. "Some of you will rise to meet it. Others will be left behind. Private Lawson has earned her place. The rest of you will decide whether to follow, resist, or crumble." The room was silent. Every soldier felt the weight of the statement pressing down, a challenge that extended far beyond physical skill. This was a test of character, of ego, of the ability to recognize true authority when it stood before them. Carter's eyes met Ray's, a mixture of frustration, fear, and reluctant acknowledgement. For the first time, he realized he had miscalculated entirely. Every attempt to intimidate, every show of bravado, every assumed advantage had crumbled in the face of her skill, discipline, and quiet authority. Ray adjusted her jacket, her movements precise and calm. The day's physical and mental exertion had left her fatigued, yet she radiated focus and composure. She had delivered the lesson, set the standard, and established her authority. The reckoning was complete, but it was only the beginning of the shift she had brought to this barracks. The soldiers around her, some with awe, some with grudging respect, began to understand that the landscape had changed. Where once arrogance and intimidation held sway, now discipline, skill, and earned authority reigned supreme. As the night deepened, a quiet thought lingered in every mind. Ray Lawson had survived far more than they could imagine, and she was only beginning to show the extent of her capabilities. Carter, alone in the corner, clenched his fists one last time. He had been humbled, forced to reckon with a standard he hadn't expected. Ray Lawson had outmaneuvered, outperformed, and outlasted them all, not through force, but through skill, discipline, and an unshakable presence. The barracks were quiet now, but the energy of the reckoning remained, heavy and electric. Every soldier understood the truth. The arrival of Ray Lawson had shifted the hierarchy, and there was no returning to the way things had been. One thought hung over them all, impossible to ignore. This woman was untouchable, unstoppable, and far from finished. The dawn broke over the barracks like a promise, painting the concrete and metal with streaks of gold and orange. The yard was quiet, but the energy was palpable, a lingering charge from the trials of the past days. Every soldier moved differently now. There was a cautious respect in their steps, a weight behind their gazes, and a whispered acknowledgement that nothing would ever be the same. Ray Lawson stood at the center of the yard, calm, collected, and fully aware of the change she had wrought. The past week had tested her beyond measure, not in the way most recruits were tested, but in the subtle, unrelenting war of perception, authority, and patience. She had faced challenges designed to break her presence, to diminish her skill, and to question her legitimacy. She had survived, and she had dominated. The soldiers assembled, heads slightly bowed, energy tense but expectant. Carter was among them, shoulders square, jaw tight, but his demeanor was different. He had been humbled, forced to reckon with the full measure of Ray's capabilities, and now the last shred of his arrogance had been tempered with reluctant respect. Commander Hawk appeared again, his boots striking the concrete in a steady rhythm that demanded attention. The soldiers instinctively straightened, and even Carter's stubborn posture softened. Hawk's gaze swept the yard, lingering on Ray with a subtle nod, a gesture that spoke volumes. She had earned more than respect. She had earned a legacy. "Today," Hawk began, voice calm but resonant, "you will see why leadership is not about rank, nor is it about intimidation. Leadership is about action, decisiveness, and the ability to earn respect in the face of challenge. Private Lawson," he said, locking eyes with her, "you will demonstrate that legacy in practice." Ray's response was a small, controlled nod. She didn't need words. The soldiers already understood the gravity of her presence. She was not just another recruit. She was the benchmark, the standard, the living proof of what discipline, skill, and quiet authority could achieve. The exercise began, a full-scale field simulation designed to test leadership, strategy, and endurance. The scenario was complex, a simulated hostage rescue under fire, requiring split-second decisions, coordination, and mental agility. The soldiers moved as one under Ray's command, their previous doubts replaced with cautious trust in her direction. Carter attempted to assert influence, but Ray anticipated every move, redirecting the team seamlessly. Every instruction was precise, every command measured. Where confusion might have erupted, cohesion emerged. The soldiers followed, not because they had to, but because they trusted her judgment, even if unwillingly at first. The climax of the simulation approached. A sudden complication, A simulated ambush threatened to derail the exercise. Soldiers froze, unsure of the correct course of action. Carter hesitated, caught between instinct and hesitation. Ray, however, moved with practiced decisiveness, stepping into the breach, assessing threats, and issuing orders that were executed flawlessly. The team responded with precision, neutralizing simulated threats, securing objectives, and maintaining cohesion under pressure. The exercise concluded with total success, the soldiers exhausted but alive with adrenaline and newfound respect. Carter stood apart, chest heaving, a flicker of awe in his eyes. He had finally seen firsthand what Ray Lawson was capable of. Hawk approached once more, his expression neutral but approving. "Private Lawson," he said quietly, "you have shown them the weight of experience, the value of discipline, and the meaning of earned respect. Your legacy is not in the victories alone, but in the impact you leave on those who follow." Ray lowered her gaze briefly, acknowledging the words with silent humility. She had not sought recognition, only to execute with precision and lead with authority. Yet the acknowledgement was meaningful. Her legacy wasn't just her own. It was now intertwined with the soldiers she had challenged, tested, and ultimately elevated. The soldiers around her began to understand the full measure of her presence. Whispers spread. "She's unstoppable," one muttered. "I didn't think anyone could command respect like that," said another. Even Carter, standing off to the side, let out a long breath, a subtle nod of acknowledgement. He hadn't just learned to respect her. He had learned to understand the standard she represented and the weight of leadership she embodied. Ray addressed the soldiers finally, her voice calm but carrying authority. "You've been tested, challenged, and pushed. The lessons you've learned here are not just about strength or skill, they're about character, about resilience, about understanding that respect is earned, not demanded. Carry that forward and you'll understand what it truly means to serve." The barracks were silent, the gravity of her words sinking in. This was not just a speech. It was the final lesson, the culmination of days of challenges, confrontations, and tests. Every soldier present felt the weight of her authority, the clarity of her judgment, and the undeniable impact she had left. Carter stepped forward finally, hesitant but sincere. "Private Lawson," he said, voice low, I get it now. You're something else. I can't argue with it anymore." Ray's gaze met his, steady and unflinching. "Good," she said softly. "Now let's move forward together." The soldiers exhaled collectively. The tension that had gripped the barracks for days began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of clarity, cohesion, and respect. Ray Lawson had done more than survive the challenges. She had transformed the environment, leaving an indelible mark on every soldier who had doubted her. Hawk watched from the edge of the yard, silent and approving. The legacy of a soldier was measured not just in victories, but in the influence they left behind. Ray's presence, her authority, and her unwavering skill had established a standard that would echo long after she was gone from the barracks. As the sun climbed higher, casting long, sharp shadows across the yard, Ray stood at the center, calm and poised. The soldiers moved around her with a newfound understanding of hierarchy, respect, and the power of earned authority. The lessons had been harsh, the tests relentless, but the legacy was clear. Ray Lawson was untouchable, unshakable, and a standard that would shape the barracks for years to come. And in that quiet, powerful moment, every soldier realized something profound. They had witnessed the rise of a legend, a force of nature whose authority was absolute, and whose legacy would endure far beyond the walls of the barracks. Ray turned to Hawk, her gaze steady, and offered a brief, formal salute. Hawk returned it, the silent exchange speaking volumes about recognition, trust, and respect earned through action rather than words. The soldiers watched, understanding that what they had seen was more than leadership. It was a standard, a benchmark, and a reminder of the power of skill, discipline, and calm authority. The barracks, once filled with tension and doubt, now resonated with a quiet energy. Every soldier carried the lessons of the past days in their posture, their movements, and their understanding of what true leadership looked like. And as Ray Lawson walked through the yard, boots striking the concrete with deliberate precision, it was clear her presence would be felt long after she left. She had earned her place. She had set the standard. She had created a legacy. The sun reached its zenith, casting light on a barracks transformed, not just in hierarchy but in spirit. Ray Lawson had arrived, and the legacy she left was undeniable, permanent, and inescapable.